Thank you very much for inviting me to hear I will now give you my views on the impossibility of proving that human behavior is determined. I hope everyone has a handout, because what I'm going to do, I'm going to take you through that handout. I'm not going to read out my written paper. So, the issue is, could there be a scientific theory which, on the basis of our present state, on observing what's going on in our brain at the moment and what our mental life is, would be able to predict which intentions we form, that is to say, what we decide to try to do, and so which intentional actions we perform. And I propose to answer that question in the negative, that there couldn't be such a theory. Now, to start with a few definitions, they're on your handout. I understand by a physical event, one to which anyone can have as much access as anyone else. That there is a lectern in this room is something you can see as well as I can see, and no one, if they try hard, is in a privileged position with regard to that. On the other hand, I understand by a mental event, one to which the subject has privileged access. That is to say, I know better than you whether I'm seeing a lectern in this room, because I have access to what my experiences are in a way that you don't. The example I gave of a mental event is what I call an impure mental event. An impure mental event is one which the occurrence of which entails a physical event. That is to say, my seeing a lectern here entails there is a lectern here, which is a physical event. But there are also, crucially, pure mental events, that is to say, ones which do not entail the occurrence of a physical event. My seeming to see a lectern here is a pure mental event that doesn't entail anything about the physical world. And there are, I suggest, 5 different kinds of pure mental event. There are sensations, such as sensations of pain or patterns of color in the visual field, feelings of heat, and so on. There are beliefs. I believe that today is Friday. And these beliefs also include moral beliefs. There are beliefs about this action is the best one to do in these circumstances, and so on. And then there are occurrent thoughts. It crosses my mind that there are a lot of people here. And then there are desires. I understand by desires inclinations that we find within ourselves to do this or that. I might desire to drink, desire to be Prime Minister, or whatever. And then there are, above all, intentions. Now, as I'm understanding intentions, someone's intention, by that I mean their intention in what they're doing, what they're trying to achieve by what they're doing. Thus, my intention in waving my hand is to draw your attention to a philosophical point. It's what I'm trying to do thereby. So, sensations, thoughts, beliefs, desires, and intentions. Okay. Now, if there's to be a deterministic theory of human behavior, it will be a deterministic theory of the public intentional actions we perform. And it will have one of 2 shapes. It will either be what I call an epiphenomenalist theory, or it will be a psychophysical theory. Now, by an epiphenomenalist theory, I mean one that explains all our public actions merely in terms of brain events. It says one brain event causes another brain event, causes another brain event, eventually causes my hand to move. And my intentions, my thoughts, my beliefs make no difference to that. The alternative kind of theory, which superficially is certainly more plausible, is the psychophysical theory, which says that our brain states, which are, of course, physical events, and our mental events interact. Our brain states influenced no doubt by the outside world, cause us to have certain beliefs and certain desires, and these desires interact in a certain way, and they lead to more beliefs. We put some of our beliefs together and get another one, and then we have beliefs about what's best to do, and we have a desire about what to do, and sometimes these clash and sometimes they don't, and eventually this leads to an intention, and the intention causes a brain event which causes a public act. So there are two possible thoughts, two possible kinds of deterministic theory of human behavior. And I'm going to represent by the B's brain events and by the M mental events. And when I talk about mental events in future, I'm talking only about pure mental events. Now, an epiphenomenalist theory says brain state 1 causes brain state 2, causes brain state 3, causes brain state 4, leads to hand motion. I may indeed form an intention to influence the motion of my hand, but according to such a theory, the intention makes no difference to what happens. The normal explanation of what's going on by people who favor this theory is that there is, as it were, a common cause, some brain event, both of my intention to move my hand and of the hand moving. And it's because, as a matter of fact, these coincide, I have an intention to move a hand at the same time as the hand moves, I come to the fallacious belief that the intention is causing the hand movement. But according to the epiphenomenalist theory, it isn't. They just have a common cause. So for the epiphenomenalist, brain events lead to mental events, including primarily, of course, conscious events, lead to nothing. Well, that's a fashionable theory. And so far, up till about 1980, nobody really knew what was happening inside the brain. But since 1980, various techniques have been invented for finding out what's happening in the brain when we perform intentional actions. And the first experiment on these matters, done in the 1980s by Benjamin Libet, has led to a whole genre of innumerable, more sophisticated kinds of experiment with more sophisticated ways of finding out what's going on in the brain. But in order to show what I think is wrong with this kind of experiment, I will take the original Libet experiment. Now, what Benjamin Libet did, many of you may know this, but for those who don't, I go through the moves. What Benjamin Libet did was to get a number of students and sit them at desks. And in front of each student, there was a clock which moved very fast so that it would measure milliseconds, not just seconds. And attached to each student's head, there were various bits of electrical apparatus such that they could measure very slight changes in the electric potential at different parts of the brain. And Libet said to the students, sometime within the next 20 seconds, you are to move your hand. You are to decide when to move your hand, and it's going to be an act of what you think is free will on your part. So the students did this, and they moved their hands at various times. And they were also instructed to say at what time, by their clock exactly, did they form the intention. Now, what then Libet noticed is that in each case when a student might form an intention to move his hand, the hand movement occurred a little bit later, but half a second before the time at which, according to the student formed the intention to move the hand, there was a build-up of electric potential at a certain point on the skull. And what that showed, said Libet, is that, as it were, we were already predetermined to form the relevant intention and form the relevant intention half a second later. and, as it were, those who formed the intentions towards the end of the 22nd, the build-up of the potential on the skull only occurred half a second before that. So this seemed to suggest that some going on in the brain half a second before the forming of an intention had already set in train a sequence of movements leading to a hand movement, and that this, which occurred half a second after that, had no influence on what's going on. So this seemed to support the epiphenomenalist view. Now, I don't think even by his own standards, apart from the point I'm now going to make, it did support that view, but at any rate, it has generated a whole range of very similar kinds of experiments trying to detect the moment at which people form their intentions and trying to show that that didn't make any difference to what's going to happen. Right. And this was therefore generalized into the view that this sort of thing makes no difference to this sort of thing. And the suggestion was, in fact, that there, therefore, as it were, not merely does this not influence things, but there's a pretty deterministic chain of brain events which does influence things. Now, there is, I think, a crucial flaw in any generalization of these particular results. I don't wish to question these particular results, but the generalization from that to never do our beliefs, thoughts, purposes, intentions, etc. make a difference to our action is basically flawed for this very simple reason. It's crucial for the generalization that the experimenter knows the time at which the intention is formed. I mean, if the intention was formed here, it wouldn't show anything. It's the fact the intention is formed here that it shows that. Okay, so how do we know at what time the intention was formed? Well, the students tell us. Why should we believe what students tell us? Well, they're pretty honest sort of people, of course. But why we believe them is because we think they are looking out for this intention, and they notice this intention in their mental life, and they form the intention, a different intention, to tell us what their intention is. And they think the words come out of their mouth because of their intention to tell us the time at which they formed their intention. And if we didn't think that, if we didn't think, as it were, the words were coming out of their mouth because they had a certain belief about when they formed the intention, we wouldn't believe what they were telling us. So, you will see the obvious consequences. It may be that in this experiment, this is not making a difference to that. But our only reason for believing this must be because we believe that some other intention to tell us the truth is making a difference to a brain event and what comes out of our mouth. So you can't generalize this sort of result. You can only believe that this kind of account, the epiphenomenalist account, works in a certain area for certain kinds of actions in certain circumstances if you disbelieve that it holds generally. So if you think that it holds generally, you wouldn't have any knowledge of the mental life, and therefore you couldn't show anything by this sort of method. Okay. Now, that's not the only way in which one can try and prove an epiphenomenalist theory. What is crucial here is we attempt to prove the theory by showing that this sort of thing is uninfluenced by that sort of thing, and we try and show that by showing when this sort of thing, the mental event, occurs. But there might be another way of showing that these things make no difference without actually knowing what they are or when they occur. One might devise a theory of physics which was deterministic, which had the consequence that for every physical event, including therefore brain events, there was some preceding physical event which was necessary and sufficient for the occurrence of the later one. And this one would establish by doing a large number of experiments and getting the simplest account which one could get from those experiments. And that would suggest that nothing but brain events or other physical events make a difference to brain events. So these things can't make a difference to brain events. And to set up such a theory, one doesn't have to have knowledge of anyone's mental life. One can just observe the brain. Well, that looks as if it might work. But now then, in order to establish this theory and to get good predictions from it, what we must do, we have to know two things. First, we have to know what the theory predicts, and secondly, we have to observe that what the theory predicts in fact occurs. Now, the trouble is, how are we going to know what the theory predicts? Theories of physics are highly complicated things, and it takes some time to work out what the prediction of the theory for a particular setup would be. Well, how do you and I know whether some physicist has got it right? Well, he tells us. He tells us that his theory has predicted so-and-so, and he's observed so-and-so. Why should we believe the physicist? Well, physicists try and tell us the truth. They try and tell us that the calculations they have reached in their head, or by some sort of observation, have the consequence that the theory predicts this. Our reason for believing the physicist is we think it's clear to the physicist in his mind that that is so, and he is trying to tell us what is in his mind. In other words, we believe that in this case, what his thoughts in his mind are being transmitted to us because he has a belief that he's proved this and the intention to tell us. And we believe the words that come out of his mouth because he has the intention to tell us. So once again, although we may know what's occurred without there being any downward causation, we can't know that the theory's predicted anything without there being any downward causation. At least we non-scientists from outside rely on scientists, and to rely on scientists is to rely on what they say about the processes of their mental life, and we can't get that without, we can't believe that without there being a downward causation. Now you may say scientists might do their calculations on paper, and sure they might, but they've got to see that what they've written on the paper, in fact, it's got to be clear to them that that in fact shows that the theory predicts this. And they've got to tell us that the theory predicts this on the basis of what they've seen, and they've written on the paper what they have because they've worked out something in their head. So once again, there's two processes of downward causation coming on from their mental thoughts to what's on their paper and to what they've written. What they tell us. And of course you may say, well, can't they know about that their theory is correct, even if they can't tell us without any downward causation? But they need to remember the earlier stages. They've got to believe that this result they've reached, they've reached because of the earlier stages in their calculation. And that's to say they've got to remember what the earlier stages were, and remember they've come to this prediction as a result of calculating from the earlier stages. Now we know that we only remember things because when we have an experience, 10 minutes ago, this produces some trace in our brain, which in turn leads us to remember it. So memory only works because, once again, there's a downward causation. The event in our mental life causes a brain state. The event in our mental life causes a brain state, and this enables us to remember later what has happened. So once again, you can't establish, you can't have a grounds for believing an epiphenomenalist theory unless it makes predictions. you can only know that it makes predictions if there is downward causation from mental life to brain states. Either downward causation in the sense that the agent tells us what brain events is happening in order to show us that the theory makes predictions, or if the agent has to tell us what the theory predicts in order to show that he's got it right. And either way, we can only believe that the epiphenomenalist theory works for certain areas if we are prepared also to believe that it doesn't work in other areas. And in particular, we've got to, if we are to have grounds for any such theory of this kind, we have to think that what happens in the mental life, the conscious life of student subjects or scientists who give us information, causes them to say what they do to us, and that the past stages of their calculations cause them via brain states to remember what they have calculated. And either way, they have to believe in a downward causation in order to have any in one area, in order to believe that it doesn't operate in another area. So any attempt to prove a deterministic theory of an epiphenomenalist kind is bound to fail. Whatever the experimental result that might be produced in a lab tomorrow, it simply won't work, because the only reason for believing the experimental result in the lab depends on assuming that epiphenomenalism is not universally true. Okay. Now, the reason this theory has failed is because it's failed to make predictions, because the predictions depend on the assumption the theory is false. Now, it's very important that a scientific theory should meet that criterion. But a scientific theory has another kind of criterion which it ought to meet. And that is to say, it has to be a simple theory. Now, consider some very ordinary theory of mechanics, that a system of particles interacting, bouncing off each other, inelastic particles, momentum is conserved. If one particle loses a certain amount of mass times velocity, the other particle gains a certain amount of mass times velocity. Right. Now, this theory is a simple theory in the sense that it says in any collision, whether it's between masses of 10 pounds, masses of 20 pounds, velocities of 100 miles an hour, or velocities of 1,000 miles an hour, exactly the same formula applies. But suppose it were the case that the momentum of subsequent particles depended in a rather more complicated way on the momentum of earlier particles. Suppose there was one law when the earlier particle was of 9 kilograms in weight, and a quite different law for when it was 10 kilograms in weight, such that there was no connection between these laws. That's to say, there was a law of momentum for 10 kilogram particles, and a quite different law. Say it might be that mv is conserved for 10 kilogram particles, but it's half mv squared that's conserved for 9 kilogram particles, and 1 over mv that's conserved for 8 kilogram particles, and so on. Now, if you started to find that was the case, you would then have no grounds for making any predictions about anything beyond particles which had exactly those particular masses. And you'd be pretty dubious about those predictions, because you would say, well, there must be some connection between these things, and that means that we can't really rely on this extraordinary law for particles of 8 kilogram mass going on forever, because clearly this whole system is liable to go wrong at some stage. Okay, now my point in making that point is that when we come to a psychophysical theory, we're going to run into just this problem. The only possible psychophysical theory of human behavior is going to have innumerable numbers of different laws which have little connection with each other. So many of them that, all right, we might be able to predict what would happen to a person who had exactly those brain states, beliefs, desires, and so on in the same way another time, but we can't make any predictions about someone who has a slightly different belief that he didn't have before, or a slightly different desire, or a slightly different brain state. Now, let me say why. If you are to have that sort of theory, go back a preliminary point. So we've moved on to the suggestion that what's happening is this, roughly speaking. Certainly, brain states might lead to our having beliefs and desires of various sorts. These might interact with each other in the sense that one belief might suggest another. One desire might conflict with some belief about what we thought worth doing, and we'd have to decide between them, and so on, until that all worked up to an intention which we sought to execute. Now, sometimes, quite clearly, we can make, and are right to make, predictions from someone's mental life at a time to what they will do. If somebody has a belief that this kind of action is the best thing to do in this circumstance, and he has no desire to do anything else, then we can infer from that that he will form an intention to do that thing, and he would do it. And if someone has a desire to do a certain action, and that's stronger than his desire to do any other action, and no belief about it not being a good thing to do this sort of action, then he will do that sort of action. If you know that a certain brain state will cause me to feel thirsty, and you know I have no beliefs about it being wrong to drink things, and no rival desires, you can predict that I will drink. Okay, so there's obviously going to be a certain amount of determinism, you can call it, in our behavior. What, however, is at stake is whether we have a choice when, in our view, there are two things which we equally desire to do, or two things which we think equally best actions to do, or above all, when we have a choice between what we think best to do and what we desire, feel inclined to do, between fulfilling our desire for more cream cake as opposed to a belief that it would be bad to do so. In those circumstances, clearly what goes on in our mental life at the conscious level is not going to determine what we will do. If anything determines what we will do, it will be the interaction with what goes on in the conscious level with what's going on here. All the time they'll be up and down. Now, could you have a theory that would predict what we would do in those kinds of circumstances? Now, that's where the problem starts. These things are measurable things. They are the brain states consist of, our brains consist of large number of nerve cells, neurons, which connect with each other, and what goes on in our brain is a matter of how many connections each neuron has with another connection, and how distant it is from the neuron with which it has a connection, and how often these neurons fire, that is, transmit electrical potential to the next thing. And so there are certain measurable features of our brain of a fairly small finite kind. The location of neurons, the connections of neurons, the patterns of electric charge of neurons. So something nice, measurable, and physical. What we've got at this level is not that sort of thing at all. It's a belief that it's a sunny day, or that today is Friday, or that it's good to do philosophy, and so on. You can't measure those. They can't be given a number. One doesn't have, my belief that today is Friday doesn't have more of some quality or less of some quality than my belief that it has, that it's a sunny day. They're just different. And the differences are, the only way to, as it were, articulate the differences is to have a theory of language that says, well, someone's belief that so-and-so amounts to their ability to recognize cases of so-and-so and their ability to make inferences of such a kind. And it takes a dictionary and a grammar of a language to lay down all the rules for how different mental states differ from each other. Worse than that, everybody has slightly different beliefs which they will publicly articulate by the same words from each other, because everybody understands by, say, just to take one example, this is a table, something slightly different from what anyone else understands by it. That's to say, some people will count a sideboard as a table, some people will count a desk as a table, other people won't count this, and so on. And, okay, I'm exaggerating slightly to say everybody has totally different from everybody else, but many people have rather different, slightly different at any rate, beliefs from anybody else which they would articulate publicly. And therefore, if you are to have a theory even of how which beliefs would be produced by a certain brain state, and the same goes for desires and thoughts and so on, you would have to study different individuals and try and see what would produce in them by that. But that won't tell you what will happen in anybody else, because they have a different system of concepts, slightly different system of concepts. And therefore, any law, if you could ever have one, for one individual is going to be a bit different from the law you would have for another individual. And this is borne out, actually, by a recent psychological work which showed a subject certain pictures. It was of implements of certain kind. They might show someone a picture of a hammer, and then observe what happens in different parts of the brain in different subjects when they observe the hammer. And generally, of course, somewhat similar things happened in most subjects when they observed the hammer. But never did exactly the same thing happen in every subject. And that brought out that we are different because we have different concepts. And if you want to study how our beliefs, how our brain states cause our beliefs, then you've got to have separate laws for individuals. So you can't measure these things at all. They don't have a number. If you're just to produce laws for each kind of belief, each particular belief that someone might have, then you've got to make laws different for each individual. What we do with these things depends also on the strength of these things. It's the strength of a sensation that makes a difference to whether strength of the itch makes a difference to whether I scratch it or not. And so the beliefs, the sensations and so on have to have a strength if we are to calculate what happens. But although we can say when one sensation is stronger than another one, What we can't say is when it's twice as strong as another one. That is to say, we can only give a comparative measurement. There's no sense. Doctors sometimes ask their patients, is this twice as painful as that? Well, you have no measure. It can't be done. Furthermore, the whole problem is ruined by the fact that if we are to collect all these data, there are certain sort of data that we can't even possibly collect because we haven't got a clue what people mean by their statements of their sensation. Because although you and I might recognize the same objects as green objects and therefore as a green sensation, what we don't know is whether you recognize it as green on the basis of the same sensations as I recognize it as green. Maybe my sensations are a bit brighter or a bit redder or something than yours. So the situation is now that we're just not going to, we would have to have enormous numbers of laws differing for each individual, connecting measurable things with non-measurable things, of which there are innumerable measurable things for each individual, many of which, and even innumerable non-measurable things for any individuals, which will have strengths, which again we are not able to measure, and which will influence our behavior. Now, this doesn't, of course, follow from this that our behavior isn't determined, but what does follow is that in order to show that it is, we would have to replicate large numbers of experiments in exactly the same circumstances as before. We would have to, as it were, get hold of subjects from birth, put them in rooms without windows, identical twins, and then try and ensure that the input to each twin was exactly the same, and then work out whether the response was the same. And that's not going to happen. Even if it did happen, there's still going to be a difference because one twin would be in one place and hear one noise louder than the other when one would, and still it wouldn't work. So, conclusion, we're never going to be able to have a system of laws which enables us to make predictions about what people will do in different circumstances, because we would have to have so many different kinds of laws, each of which will only be applicable to persons with certain brain states and certain previous mental life, because the effect of one belief on us depends on what the other beliefs have, and therefore you can't work out what the belief on its own is going to make a difference to. So we're just not going to have these laws. All we're going to have is probabilistic laws. People with certain sorts of beliefs and certain sorts of brain states are more likely to do this sort of thing than other people. Okay, but that doesn't show that their behavior is determined. It only shows that they're subject to influences which make it more likely that they will do this rather than that. So what are we to conclude from this if we can't get a deterministic theory for the reasons I've given? Well, you might say that doesn't show there isn't one. Well, no, but note that the kinds of things we're unable to predict, and I did comment earlier that there are certain things we are able to predict, the kind of things we're unable to predict are what we will do in circumstances where we have to make decisions between two actions which seem to us equally good, two actions which seem to us equally desired, and between what we desire to do, above all, when there is a decision between what we desire to do and what we feel inclined to do, our desires. And it's in just those circumstances that we feel that we are making a decision, that it's we who are making a decision. What shall I do in this moral dilemma circumstance, which is not what we are deciding, most of us, for most of the day. We're going on autopilot most of the day, and the desires turn up, and we succeed, we fulfill them, and so on. And it is an epistemological principle, which I call the principle of credulity, that you ought to believe that things are as they seem to be in the absence of counter-evidence. You ought to believe that here is a table unless someone can show you it's a hologram. You ought to believe that it's sunny outside unless someone can show you that it's only a picture on the wall, and so on. And if it seems to you that you're making a decision and nobody can show you you're not, it's reasonable to suppose that you're right about this. And therefore, I think it is reasonable to believe that we do make decisions which are not influenced fully, although of course not determined fully, although of course influenced by our other mental life and our belief states. Thank you.
I want to start by saying that I've learned, and I continue to learn a lot from you, Dr. Swinburne, by both reading your books and in person, and I'm personally very appreciative of your continued work and contribution. Now, in the paper just presented, I'm not completely sure that there's a real challenge that's been levied against an epiphenomenalist reading of the kinds of experiments that he talked about, the Benjamin Libet experiments. I'll call them Libet-style experiments. And to recap Dr. Swinburne's argument, and he'll tell us later if I've got it wrong, but the first is neuroscientists trust participants' self-report to time the mental event of willing or intending to move. And in order to trust this self-report, neuroscientists must rely on participants' judgments. In relying on participants' judgments or their own judgments, the neuroscientist is making a causal assumption, namely that our beliefs and intentions often cause our movements, including our vocalizations. Epiphenomenalism undermines this causal assumption, thus rendering trust in the participant's judgments unjustified. So to this argument, I'm not endorsing this argument, but this is what I think an epiphenomenalist might say, is that they might say that a participant's neural system is organized and has developed in such a way that they are able to accurately respond to questions about the timing events, mental or physical, even though conscious willing or conscious intending is an illusion. So in this case, the causal assumption they'd be making as epiphenomenalists is the individual report is accurate because even though it's purely mechanistic and purely neural, and at the same time, given what Dr. Swinburne has said, the epiphenomenalist may still maintain that the individual's report about the timing of the mental event of willing or of intending to move can be trusted without being inconsistent. And the trust of the neuroscientist would just rest on the evolutionary process, the person's past developmental experiences that have engineered their neural system in such a way that they're able to give accurate reports. Similarly, the neuroscientist might further claim that they too have been so engineered and thus claim that they are capable of making accurate judgments about what Libet-style experiments show without making the causal assumption that Dr. Swinburne has implied that they must make, the assumption that intentions cause certain bodily movements and vocalizations. Having said this, I do agree with Dr. Swinburne that Libet-style experiments don't provide evidence that we are not voluntary or intentional agents, but I have different reasons. I am of the position that the design of these experiments and the conclusion that they provide evidence that we are not voluntary agents is predicated on a certain inaccurate volitional theory. And roughly, the volitional theory is as follows. Voluntary and intentional action is bodily motion that has a certain mental event in its causal history. And we can be currently conscious of this mental event. So we are conscious of when it occurs. So, for example, Cain's murder of Abel is voluntary and intentional. Granted, Cain's body moved in a way that led to Abel's death, and this motion was caused by either a particular kind of conscious mental event or, according to a slightly different version, by Cain's performance of a certain mental act. However, there's been another, and I believe more accurate account of voluntary and intentional action. I will call this account the Aristotelian account, since its contours can be traced back to some of his works. According to the Aristotelian account, voluntary and intentional action is a way of exercising a two-way power, and that is a power to act or not act on a given occasion. I can either act or not act in the awareness of certain things, such as what I'm doing and that I'm able to behave differently at this moment. So to return to our example, Cain's murder of Abel is voluntary and intentional because Cain brings about Abel's death, is aware of what he's doing, and he is aware he could do something else, and he's not under duress. He's not being forced. And on this account, to be aware of what one is doing, or aware that one is able to do something else, does not correspond with any mental event which one is currently conscious of. We are aware of all kinds of things that inform how we act and think throughout the day without thinking about these things or otherwise directing our mental activities toward them. We are aware of these things outside the time frame of any occurrence of any conscious mental event. So bringing to the Aristotelian account, voluntary and intentionally acting is bringing about motion of one's body in a certain state of awareness, and this awareness doesn't correspond with any mental event of which we are currently conscious. And in this case, there's no conscious mental event of willing or intending to be timed in the first place. Thus, the mental event that is being timed in Libet-style experiments is actually some kind of urge, sensation, feeling, or thought that can, but need not accompany certain actions. At this juncture, I merely want to suggest, given that we have historically two different kinds of accounts of voluntary and intentional conduct, at most we should think of Libet-style experiments, and this is at most, as providing evidence that a volitional theory, which is just merely one way of thinking about voluntary conduct, is inaccurate. These experiments should not lead us to think that voluntary agency is altogether an illusion. I'd like to make one final point. I think Dr. Swinburne has provided a convincing argument for why the causal closure of the physical with respect to the relevant neural activities will never be proven. But I think that a diehard causal closurist might not argue otherwise. And this is what I think they might argue. I think they might say, well, we have good evidence from physics and possibly chemistry and biology that everything that happens in the universe can be explained by physical laws. Our brains are part of the furniture of the universe, and so we also have good evidence that they too operate according to physical laws. Given this position, the fact that our brains and mental lives are so complex and multiform, so as to ensure that we will never be able to prove that our brains operate entirely according to physical laws, is not by itself likely to surprise the causal closurist or give them pause. Rather, the causal closurist is likely to argue that the skeptic who thinks that our brains do not operate entirely according to physical laws is failing to apply the lessons learned about the universe to our brains. Having said this, given Dr. Swinburne's point that it's impossible to prove that brains operate entirely according to physical laws, we might give the causal closurist pause and make them start to question their initial premise. And we might make them question their view that there is good evidence that everything that happens can be explained by physical laws. And having pointed this out, with the time allotted, I can do no more than outline a substantial and sustained argument that has been developed by Nancy Cartwright against the empirical basis for thinking that everything that happens in the universe can be explained by physical laws. Cartwright, an influential philosopher of science, has used extensive concrete illustrations, mostly from physics, to make the case that the success of our best physics theories supports their truth, but not their universality. She argues that we only have evidence to support the application of the laws of physics to a limited range of circumstances, namely the range we consider when we're formulating those laws. And if this is true of physics, it's equally true for other natural sciences. Cartwright argues that when we begin to look at the various laws we have developed, they are the kinds of laws you would expect of a stratified world, wherein laws are useful and applicable only under certain circumstances, and wherein there may commonly be occurrences that are subject to no law. As she states, the laws that describe our world, and I quote, look like and steadfastly stick to looking like science as we know it, apportioned into disciplines, apparently arbitrarily grown up, governing different sets of properties of different levels of abstraction, pockets of great precision, large parcels of qualitative maxims resisting precise formulation, as Dr. Swinburne pointed out. Erratic overlaps here and there, once in a while corners that line up, but mostly ragged edges, and always the cover of law just loosely attached to jumbled world of material things. What is happening is more like an outcome of negotiation between domains than a logical consequence of a whole system, one system of order. It may, of course, be true, and that's the end of the quote, it may, of course, be true that the idea that everything that happens in the universe can be explained by physical laws is consistent with the fact we can and do design and use laws to explain at least a sector of what happens in the world. But we must remember that being consistent with is not the same thing as being warranted by, or then being the only plausible way of coming to terms with. This is what I'll say about this topic. Here it's enough to bring up the point that thinking there's evidence that everything that happens in the universe can be explained by physical laws is contentious at best, and continues to be a matter of debate amongst philosophers of science. Therefore, while upholding the causal closure of the physical may be incompatible with upholding the idea we are voluntary agents, the grounds for upholding the causal closure of the physical are a very tenuous basis for rejecting the idea we are voluntary or intentional agents. Thank you.
So if I had more time than the jackbooted Tom Crisp has allowed, I could go into greater detail in expressing my gratitude for the work of Richard Swinburne. But as things stand, I'll just say that I am indeed thankful to God for the insight and inspiration that Professor Swinburne's work has provided me. It's well known that Professor Swinburne is a distinctively systematic thinker. I admire this aspect of his work enormously. Not only is it very difficult to achieve the kind of wide and deep integration of argument characteristic of his work, such integration also stands to reveal interrelations and dependencies between ideas that would otherwise remain hidden from us. However, Swinburne's systematicity presents commentators like Jason and myself with a special challenge, I think. We're aware that Professor Swinburne's argument here is, as usual, embedded in a much larger argumentative context, the understanding of which might very well render local complaints odious. So imagine someone, maybe like myself, who's largely in the dark regarding the complex interworkings of mechanical watches. And when this person is shown a particular intricately crafted bit of gearing pulled from the guts of a watch, he may very well be puzzled about how this piece could contribute to timekeeping. In my own case, at least, I worry that the concerns I'm about to raise might indeed be of this ignorant sort. To the degree that they are, I invite Professor Swinburne to treat them as requests to show us more about his wider project here and the connection between that project and this one. That is, I invite him to tell us more about timekeeping in general and about the particular watch that this bit of gearing he has shared with us today is a part of. So I begin by noting that the title of his presentation is The Impossibility of Proving That Human Behavior is Determined. There's three different views about this going on, right? There's the one that's on the advertisement that describes it as the impossibility of proving determinism. This actual paper says the impossibility of proving that human behavior is determined. Then we have this one, the impossibility of physical determinism. I take all of those three theses to be slightly different, so I'll be asking for some clarification about that. But strictly speaking, the claim, the impossibility of proving that human behavior is determined, that's what philosophers in our admittedly technical jargon are likely to call a sexy thesis. I don't know if I'm allowed to say sexy thesis at Biola in Calvary Chapel, but there it is. But yeah, it would be a first? Okay, and just before we got started here, JP said to me, Dan, don't embarrass us. You're only here 2 more days. Hold it together. So I may have failed that injunction already, JP, I'm not sure. Okay. But what we mean in philosophy by a sexy thesis is one that's provocative, that gets at something important and interesting and then maybe is even a bit surprising. But when Swinburne announces his formal conclusion at the very beginning of his talk, the thesis, I think, loses some of its initial sexiness. There he tells us that the conclusion is something like this, that it is immensely improbable that there could ever be a well-justified theory which predicted with 100% success which intentional actions humans would do in all situations. That's a quote. And the improbability, he tells us, is going to be due to the fact that, quote, our criteria for a well-justified scientific theory make it almost impossible for a theory of this kind to be well-justified, unquote. So the concerns I'm going to raise about the argument he presents all have to do with my inability to see just what it could tell us, his argument, even if sound, about any interesting version of the claim that human behavior is determined. So my brief strategy is going to be to grant Swinburne his conclusion, but go on to wonder if anything important about the thesis of determinism can follow. So now, as far as I can see, we haven't been told what precisely it would mean if human behavior is determined in the way Swinburne has in mind. That is, it isn't clear from what Swinburne has told us here either what the relevant concept of determinism is supposed to be, or what the consequences for human behavior would be if this kind of determinism turned out to obtain. So one thesis of determinism that's likely to jump immediately to mind is the one ordinarily deployed, for example, in debates about free will and moral responsibility. And as determinism is typically understood in these contexts, it's the thesis that the laws of nature, together with the facts about the world at some distant point in the past, circumscribe a unique future. So given the laws in the past, there's only one way for the future to unfold. We can formalize this just a bit and take the thesis to be this, SD, or standard determinism, and it says this: the world is governed by or is under the sway of standard determinism if and only if, given a specified way things are at a time, the way things go thereafter is fixed as a matter of natural law. Right? So determinism, you've got a description of the way the world is at a certain time. Natural law determines everything that goes forward after that. So is this the thesis of determinism that Swinburne has in mind in his title? I'm not sure. Maybe. Though standard determinism comes preloaded with philosophical import the history of the free will debate has conferred upon it, it does seem that Swinburne may have something less general in mind. So maybe the thesis Swinburne's after is this, call it psychophysical determinism, PD. The world is governed by or is under the sway of psychophysical determinism, if and only if, given a specified way things are at a time with respect to the brain states of some subject, S, what mental states S will be in and what actions S will perform thereafter are fixed as a matter of natural law. So I've now put before us two deterministic theses, one that is recognized as of general philosophical significance and another presented as my best effort to crystallize what Swinburne may actually have in mind. And what I'll try to show now is that Swinburne's conclusion won't do much to threaten either of these theses. So would it show, for example, with the argument we've seen today, would it show that standard determinism is false? There, I think, pretty clearly not, and Professor Swinburne seems to have admitted that at a couple points in the talk. The in-principle predictability of the future entailed by standard determinism is perfectly compatible, for example, with any number of contingent obstacles to our succeeding in the project of prediction. In other words, standard determinism can be true even if Swinburne is right that we will probably never be justified in believing in our predictive power. In fact, standard determinism can be true even if we establish that we will never be able to make the predictions. After all, and again, our inability to make the predictions may be explained not by the in-principle unpredictability of the future, including human behavior, but rather by contingent limitations on our cognitive position and powers. So to see this, notice that for all Swinburne has argued here, God might very well be able to make the predictions that we cannot on the basis of full knowledge of the past and the laws of nature. So thus showing that we can't make the predictions, as Swinburne has argued, isn't sufficient to establish the falsity of standard determinism. And roughly the same kind of argument can be made with respect to the failure of Swinburne's argument to show that PD is false, the psychophysical determinism is false. It just doesn't follow from our predictive incapacities that psychophysical determinism does not obtain. And again, I take it that Swinburne admitted as much. But even if Swinburne's argument can't show us that standard determinism or psychophysical determinism are false, can't it show us that we're not epistemically justified in accepting them? I think not. The best Swinburne's argument can do, I think, is to establish that no theory like standard determinism or psychophysical determinism could be well justified on scientific grounds. It's those pesky criteria for scientific justification that are going unmet, according to Swinburne. But whether belief in standard determinism or psychophysical determinism is broadly epistemically justified is another matter. I mean, unless you think that a theory can be epistemically justified only if it is scientifically justified. But you shouldn't think that. And I'm almost certain that Professor Swinburne doesn't think this. But just in case some of you are tempted to think that, keep in mind that some theories just don't fall within the domain of the sciences in such a way as to be getting their epistemic justification from scientific justification. For example, our failure to find scientific justification for, say, a eudaimonistic moral theory surely doesn't license the conclusion that the theory is epistemically unjustified. The epistemic justification for a moral theory just may have nothing or very little to do with science. But even when theories fall within the domain of the sciences, It is nevertheless false that our epistemic justification for accepting them need be principally a matter of the theory's purely scientific credibility. So long before Big Bang cosmology added scientific credence to the claim that the universe had a beginning in time, there were various philosophical arguments to the same conclusion. I can't see any reason to think that people aware of these arguments couldn't be epistemically justified in believing that the universe has not always existed, even in ignorance of the cosmological evidence that we now have. Similarly, astute observers of human behavior probably didn't need the rigorous results of contemporary social psychology to be justified in believing that we are subject to the phenomenon of confirmation bias. So I don't see how an argument demonstrating that a theory could never be scientifically well justified would, all by itself, constitute a case against the epistemic credibility of the theory. Theories premised on deterministic theses like standard determinism and psychophysical determinism may be able to get their epistemic justification from something other than their scientificiness. So thus, I don't see, that's you can use that. So what I don't see then is how Swinburne's argument could show us that belief in standard determinism or psychophysical determinism is epistemically unjustified, even if it succeeds in showing us that no such theory could get the scientific stamp of approval. So to be clear, I accept neither standard determinism nor psychophysical determinism. Indeed, I reject them both. And I hold out some glimmer of hope that I'm epistemically justified in doing so. But I suspect that my rejection of them can't get much of whatever epistemic justification it has from Swinburne's argument. Now, it may be that Swinburne had something other than standard determinism or psychophysical determinism in mind when he gave his paper its provocative title, or titles. Maybe other people forced those titles on you, I don't know. But if so, then I would be happy to hear what this thesis was, how the conclusion he takes himself to have established is related to it, and why we should care about it. That is, I'm happy to learn more about timekeeping and watchmaking from a truly masterful craftsman.